Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jane Harrison's play, Rainbow's End. This is a play set in the 1950s in an Aboriginal community. One of the things that I really like about this play is that while it's exploring issues of historical injustice, it doesn't do it in a simple or sort of black and white way, which you sometimes get with didactic literature. And I've said this before in other videos, I'm just not that much a fan of didactic literature generally. And so Harrison does a really good job creating a balance. It's not with something like post-colonial or anti-colonial literature, when it slips into didacticism, it's often white colonizers are bad, indigenous, oppressed, colonized people are good. Here, that's not necessarily the case. Both sides are flawed. And so that makes this much more effective, I think, as a piece of art. That being said, one of the things that Rainbow's End does slip into to a certain extent is a kind of naive hopefulness, in that because you have characters on different sides of the various conflicts in the play who work from misperceptions or inaccurate information, the limitations of their own knowledge, etc., etc. In this play, when they learn that they are wrong, they work to change their minds, which is a beautiful thing. I wish that was true more often in the real world. Unfortunately, it often is not the reality, as we in the US are very much finding out, particularly in the context of people who continue to believe proven liars and to reelect them, or to continue to watch their news shows, etc., etc. But this is not about the contemporary US. This is about 1950s Australia, or Harrison's play about 1950s Australia. So the play centers on this family of 3 generations of Indigenous women. There's Nan Deer, and her last name is Deer, but she's Nan Grandma. There's Gladys, who's Nan Deer's daughter, and then there's Dolly, who's Gladys's daughter. So we have 3 generations. The other character, the other person we have who physically appears on stage is a guy named Errol Fisher, who's a white encyclopedia salesman. And so there's a number of different conflicts here that kind of all, to a certain extent, well, okay, with the exception of one big conflict, many of them center around the white encyclopedia salesman issue. Dolly is very smart. She's done extremely well in school. She's almost done with high school. Gladys wants her to have the best possible future. And for Gladys, that means something like being a bank teller, doing something that involves math, algebra, the kinds of knowledge that Dolly has accumulated through her education. Nan Deer is much more skeptical of the possibilities of that. She thinks that what Dolly is likely to end up doing is working in the laundry at the hospital, where both Nan Deer and Gladys have sometimes worked. Dolly, for her part, wants to be a nurse, but Nan Deer represents this voice of sort of cultural anxiety, the limitations to what is available to Aboriginal people, Gladys represents a kind of, I'd say, kind of naive optimism that in the 1950s, that with Queen Elizabeth II on the throne, that things will improve for Aboriginal people, that there will be more opportunities, there will be more equality, there will be less direct racism, etc., etc. And again, it is this kind of naive faith in progress toward civil rights, equity, and opportunity. Dolly doesn't seem that politically concerned or politically oriented one way or another. She's a teenager. So when Errol Fisher, again, this white encyclopedia salesman, actually from Melbourne, the big city, shows up in this very rural area, he accidentally goes into the area where the deers live. He took a wrong turn because he has a terrible sense of direction. That becomes a recurring issue. He was supposed to go into the wealthier white neighborhood. He instead went into the poorer Aboriginal neighborhood. But he happens to, he passes Dolly, and they are instantly attracted to each other. He then meets Gladys, and Gladys is like, fuck yeah, I want encyclopedias. They're going to give us all this knowledge. And Gladys is really, really invested in knowledge and education, in part because, as we find out fairly late in the play, but we get some indications of this, she herself can't read or write, even though her mother can and her daughter can. And that's a big source of embarrassment for her. For Dolly, a big source of embarrassment is their poverty. And it's not unusual poverty for Aboriginal people in the 1950s because the Australian government very heavily regulated Aboriginal people, very heavily controlled their movements, very heavily controlled where they could live, what kind of jobs they could have, etc., etc. And so poverty and the alcoholism that goes with it, although not in the Deer family itself, is a sort of direct result of systemic colonial oppression. Gladys decides to sink a lot of their money into these encyclopedias. Errol and Dolly begin a kind of courtship, although she's very, very reluctant to do this because she is very aware that an Aboriginal girl and a white boy dating is not going to be welcome, either in white communities or in Aboriginal communities. And indeed, this is borne out later. Even though they do genuinely seem to love each other, this is borne out later when they go to a dance, and actually Dolly is mocked for her poverty, not so much directly for going with Errol, but she is afterwards raped by probably one of her cousins. There's a group of people who drink and hang around that Nandir and Gladys are constantly warning Dolly against. And it does seem to be that basically she is raped to teach her a lesson for thinking that she's better than other Aboriginal people. And Gladys and Nandir both assume that it was Errol who had raped her. Partially Nandir does because we learn later in the play that she had been raped by a white man named Fisher, earlier in her life, and he was actually Gladys's father, which Gladys doesn't know. Dolly then establishes for them that it was not him. He did not do it. But they essentially break up. They no longer see each other. Dolly rather has a baby because of this rape. And the end of the play shifts to a focus that I've not really talked about yet, which is the other major conflict of the play, which is the Aboriginal housing crisis. So the Deers start out in a humpy, which is basically a sort of shack or a hut constructed out of whatever materials are available. And we see actually twice during this play, the humpy gets flooded and a lot of their stuff gets destroyed. And they have to rebuild it basically with stuff found scavenged from the local garbage dump. This again is a significant source of shame for Dolly. Even though Errol actually seems to think that this is incredibly creative and resourceful. But even his sort of admiration for the family's ability to repurpose things by drawing attention to it makes Dolly uncomfortable. But the fact that they have been forced to live in this place that regularly floods while the higher land has been assigned for the town dump is a source of resentment for the Aboriginal community. And when they subsequently get moved out of their houses to these sort of very basic, nondescript, concrete houses, that is further these are places that the people don't feel are homes. They don't feel as a community. And so the right to determine their own place to live, the right to construct houses in their own way, to access materials, etc., is the other major conflict. It's sort of the macro political conflict, while the interpersonal issues of Dolly's future, Gladys's ambitions for education and owning an encyclopedia set, and the relationship between Errol and Dolly. This is sort of the micro level interpersonal conflicts. But one of the things, so I had said before that one of the things I really like about this is that there are positive and negative characteristics of both the white characters and Aboriginal characters. Obviously, the fact that one of her cousins rapes Dolly is one of the negative aspects of the Aboriginal characters. But for white people, it is generally one that is tied up. I mean, Errol does pursue Dolly even after she tells him not to, which is bad. It does seem more of a like, please, I really love you. Can you just talk to me, more than a go out with me or else type scenario. Still creepy. It's creepy, but I think it's not meant to be. I think it's creepy in a sort of pre-Me Too way, if that makes sense, right? Like, it's creepy in the way that, from the perspective of today, of 2025, watching some older, say, 80s romantic movies the relationships are very creepy and problematic. But at the time, they were not necessarily seen that way. The happy ending is that Dolly and Errol end up together. And so I don't think we're necessarily meant to see him as a negative character, but a flawed character. So anyway, what I was going to say, in the context of this macro political conflict, the housing crisis, the white characters, and we get two major ones here, an inspector who is played by the same actor who plays Errol, and then Errol himself. The assumption that it is better for Aboriginal people if they get absorbed into white Anglo-Australian culture. So this inspector comes, he's basically like checking out this community to write a report for the government about what should be done, re Aboriginal housing. And he says, yes, as a result of my report, things will change, Mrs. Banks. That's Gladys's last name, sorry. Things must change. The sanitation arrangements, for one. And it says Gladys and Nan exchange worried looks. And you need interim housing to ease you into the townships. Are you aware of the concept of assimilation, Mrs. Banks? Gladys isn't sure how to respond, or even if a response is required. Gladys says, yes, but Nan elbows her. Then the inspector says, the Aborigine needs to be absorbed into the community. But how can he be absorbed until he learns to live like us? I will recommend assimilation in my report. It's a vexed issue to be sure, but someone must take leadership. First, the housing problem must be fixed. After all, how can the children study in the evenings if there's no electric light? Gladys, unsure, says yes, and then the inspector says, yes, I will do all I can. But in the meantime, you need to rally yourselves. Speak to your local MPs, form a delegation, collect petitions, write letters, inform yourselves. Knowledge is power, ladies. So this is an interesting one because it introduces this thematic of white Australians not only assuming that it is better for Aboriginal people to live in the types of communities and housing, neighborhoods, etc. that white Australians live in, but assuming that Aboriginal people also want that. We later actually get this line of reasoning from Errol as well. He and Dolly are talking, and he basically is sort of promising to take her away from all this, right? He's promising to take her to the city, and they'll have this very modern life. And he starts using moral evaluations. That'd have to be better than the river. They live by this river, in case that wasn't clear from the flooding aspect. And Dolly says, I'd have to leave the river. Errol, a little bit later, I'm just going to read the bits where Errol gives these sort of moral evaluations. He says, I'm offering you a better life. She says, a better life? A little bit later, he says, the point is you could live in a real home for the first time. Dolly says, a real home? Errol says, we could even save for wall-to-wall carpet. I want to spoil you. You deserve it. You deserve better. Dolly says, better? So again, there is this sort of moral evaluation of the way in which Dolly and her family live. This assumption that not only is it objectively bad, but that they should naturally want to escape it. And Dolly pushes back on this eventually. She says, but a real home? A real home is where there are people looking out for each other. Do they do that in your home, in your family, Errol? Errol says, well, and he's got a very sort of waspish family who are not very well connected to one another. Dolly says, don't matter if the floors are dirt, don't matter one bit. And Errol, demanding, says, hang on, are you saying you'd rather live in a humpy by the river when I'm promising you the world? Dolly says, your world, and you're just assuming that your world is better. But actually, when I think about it, when I think about that nasty Nancy, this this girl who made fun of Dolly at this dance for having a dress actually made out of Nancy's discarded curtain material. She has everything that opens and shuts, and I'm not so sure it is better. I wouldn't trade places with her for anything. And as far as what you're offering, no thank you. This is my place. I'm staying right here with my mum and my nan. Errol says, but Dolly. Dolly says, no, Errol. Our life isn't perfect, but like Nan says, it's ours, and you don't respect that. I'm sorry. So that is the basis of their fight. That is essentially why they break up. And then, so at the end of the play, it is revealed that Errol Fisher, I'm going to just sum up the end of the play quickly. Gladys gives a great, just brilliant speech. I wanted to read the whole thing, but this video is getting a bit lengthy, so I want to wrap this up a little quicker. So Nan Deer finds out that Errol is not related to the man named Fisher who had raped her and was Gladys's father. So that sort of main concern she'd had about Errol and Dolly being an incestuous couple is now gone. She's much more okay with them getting married, which they both want to do. Gladys is happy about it. Everybody's happy about it. Gladys so Papa Deer is Nan's husband. He's a preacher. He plays a sort of major role in politics, Aboriginal politics, like advocating for Aboriginal rights, etc., etc. He is supposed to present this petition to, not exactly to Queen Elizabeth II, but to her government, basically on behalf of Aboriginal people, requesting rights to choose their own housing locations, rights to build houses the way that they want, rights to not have their homes inspected by a white government who gets to set its own standards and determine whether or not the way they live is sufficient. He gets caught up in a funeral, and so he's not able to be there. And so Gladys takes the stage, and she delivers this really, really powerful argument for the rights of Aboriginal people to determine their own destiny in a free and equitable society. And it's a great ending.